My name is Ramona, and I am 28 years old. I was once a classically trained pianist with a promising future until family trauma forced me to abandon the stage. My complicated relationship with my mother and sister reached its breaking point at Stephanie's wedding, where I was meant to be nothing more than background music in the corner. What my mother never expected was how my talent would silence a room of 300 guests and wipe that satisfied smile right off her face. If you are watching this from a place where music saved you too, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments. My story might remind you that sometimes the notes we are afraid to play become our greatest strength. I grew up in a picturesque middle-class suburb outside of Boston, in a white colonial house with black shutters and a perfectly manicured lawn. Our home looked like something from a magazine spread, which was exactly how my mother Amanda wanted everything in her life to appear. She was a former beauty queen who had married well and never let anyone forget it. With her honey blonde hair always perfectly styled and her signature pearl necklace that never left her neck, she carried herself with the posture of someone who was used to being watched. My older sister Stephanie was cut from the same cloth as our mother. 4 years my senior, she inherited Amanda's natural grace, her flowing blonde hair, and most importantly, her desire to please. Stephanie was the golden child who checked every box on my mother's list: cheerleader prom, queen sorority president, and eventually bride to a successful young surgeon. While Stephanie was busy fulfilling my mother's dreams, I was accidentally discovering my own. I first touched a piano at age 7 during a visit to my father Thomas's colleague's home. While the adults chatted in the living room, I wandered into a study where a beautiful baby grand piano stood in the corner. Something pulled me toward it, and when my small fingers pressed the keys, something awoke inside me. That night, I begged my parents for piano lessons. My mother initially saw my interest as another opportunity to create the perfect family image: 2 talented daughters, each exceptional in their own way. What she did not anticipate was how completely music would consume me. My first piano teacher was Mr. Sokolov, a Russian immigrant with stern eyes but gentle hands. During our first lesson, he observed as I played a simple scale. After just a few notes, he turned to my mother with raised eyebrows. "This child has something special," he said in his thick accent. "Not just good coordination, she has music in her soul." My mother smiled politely, but I could see the calculations running behind her eyes. Having a talented daughter was one thing. Having a prodigy was something else entirely. By the time I was 10, I was practicing 4 hours daily without being asked. The piano became my sanctuary, the place where I could express everything I could not say out loud in our perfection-obsessed household. While Stephanie dressed for school dances, I lost myself in Chopin and Bach. My first competition came later that year. I remember the scratchy tights my mother insisted. I wear the tight bun pulling at my scalp and the nervous sweat on my palms as I approached the stage. But the moment my fingers touched the keys, the world fell away. I played Beethoven's Für Elise with an emotional depth that Mr. Sokolov said was unusual for someone so young. When they announced my name as the winner, my mother's face lit up in a way I had rarely seen directed at me. "We need to get you a better piano," she announced on the drive home, patting my knee. "And perhaps we should consider a more prestigious teacher." Mr. Sokolov was replaced by Mrs. Abernathy, who had connections to Juilliard. Our living room furniture was rearranged to accommodate a baby grand piano. My practice schedule was extended. What had begun as joy was slowly transforming into obligation. By 12, I was winning regional competitions. My mother attended every performance, always seated in the front row, her face a mask of pleasant encouragement that would crack the moment we were alone. "You rushed the middle section," she would say, or, "Your posture was slouching toward the end. The judges noticed these things, Ramona." My father remained largely in the background occasionally, offering a proud smile or a gentle squeeze of my shoulder after performances. But he never contradicted my mother's criticisms or intervened in her growing control over my musical development. The piano remained my escape, but now I had to escape into it despite my mother's presence rather than with her blessing. I began to realize that what had started as my passion was becoming her project. The joy I found in music was being drowned out by the pressure to perform, to win, to be exceptional, in exactly the way my mother defined exceptionalism. Still, there were moments when I would practice alone late at night, playing pieces simply because they moved me, finding again that initial spark that had drawn me to music. Those moments kept me going through the increasingly demanding schedule of lessons, competitions, and recitals that consumed my early teen years. As my reputation grew in the classical music community of New England, so did my mother's expectations. What had once been praise for simple achievements became expectations of perfection. The question was no longer if I would win competitions, but by how impressive a margin. My 13th birthday gift was a recording of Vladimir Horowitz playing Rachmaninoff. As I listened to the complex emotions conveyed through those notes, I realized what I wanted music to be for me. Not a path to trophies or approval, but a language to express the depths of human experience. That realization would eventually put me on a collision course with my mother's ambitions, but at that moment, sitting in my room with those melodies washing over me, I felt a sense of purpose, taking root, that would eventually give me the strength to stand my ground. By 15, my weekends were no longer my own. While other teenagers went to football games and mall hangouts, I spent Saturdays at masterclasses and Sundays at rehearsals. My mother had mapped out a path she believed would lead me to Juilliard and beyond, and any deviation was met with immediate correction. "This is your gift, Ramona," she would say, her voice sharp, as she extended my practice time yet again. "Do you know how many people would kill for your talent? You cannot waste it on laziness." What she called laziness was usually just normal teenage activities, wanting to see a movie with friends, joining the school newspaper, or even just sleeping in on a Saturday morning. According to Amanda, anything that took time away from the piano was a distraction. My talent had become the centerpiece of her identity, her favorite topic at dinner parties and charity events. "My Ramona is being considered for the National Youth Showcase," she would tell anyone who would listen, her hand gripping my shoulder tight enough to leave marks. "Her teacher says she could be the next Martha Argerich." At home, Stephanie watched this performance with thinly veiled resentment. Once the uncontested star of our mother's attention, she now found herself sharing the spotlight. While her accomplishments in school and social circles still received praise, they could not compete with the unique glow my musical achievements brought to our mother's eyes. Stephanie found subtle ways to sabotage my practice. She would schedule her loudest phone calls during my designated piano time, accidentally spill water near my sheet music, or remind our mother about an upcoming social obligation just as I was hitting my stride with a difficult piece. Once before an important recital, she borrowed my performance shoes without asking and returned them with a scuff on the toe that sent my mother into a frenzy of last-minute polishing. Our father Thomas moved through these dynamics like a ghost occasionally materializing to offer a word of encouragement or a wan smile. A successful accountant, he spent long hours at the office, and when home preferred to maintain peace at any cost. When conflicts arose, he would retreat behind his newspaper or escape to his workshop in the garage. "Your mother just wants what is best for you girls," he would say on the rare occasions I sought his intervention. "She pushes because she believes in you." What he never acknowledged was how that pushing was crushing my spirit. The anxiety before performances grew worse with each passing year. What had once been nervous excitement transformed into nauseating dread. Before going on stage, I would often lock myself in bathroom stalls trying to control my shaking hands and racing heart. When I was 16, I was accepted to a prestigious summer music camp in Vermont. It was an honor to be invited, as only 20 pianists my age from across the country were selected. The night before I left, my mother sat at our kitchen table, with the program schedule circling the competitions and performances where I would be expected to shine. "I want you to focus on the Chopin Nocturne for the mid-session showcase," she instructed, tapping the paper with her perfectly manicured nail. "It is more accessible than the Bach you have been practicing. Judges respond to emotion, Ramona. The technical pieces impress, but the emotional ones win." I wanted to argue that the Bach piece spoke to me in ways the Chopin did not, that technique and emotion were not separate entities but part of the same musical expression. But years of having my preferences dismissed had taught me to keep such thoughts to myself. At camp, I met Julia, a cellist from Chicago with wild curly hair and opinions she never hesitated to voice. She played with a freedom I envied, choosing pieces that challenged her and interpreting them in ways that felt authentic rather than calculated for approval. "You play like you are afraid to make a mistake," she told me, after hearing me practice one evening. "Music is not about being perfect, it is about saying something true. In our cabin, after lights out, Julia would tell me about composers who broke conventions, musicians who found their voices against all odds. She introduced me to pieces I had never heard, compositions that would never appear in the competitions my mother favored, but that stirred something deep in my musical soul. Inspired by Julia, I began composing in secret. Late at night, when the practice rooms were empty, I would experiment with my own melodies, capturing emotions I never had words for. There was a piece taking shape about a bird trying to fly with clipped wings, eventually finding a way to soar despite its limitations. I never wrote it down, afraid my mother would find it, but I committed every note to memory. When I returned from camp, my mother noticed a change in my playing. "Your interpretation has become unusual," she remarked during my practice. "Let us stick with what we know works, shall we?" But the seed Julia had planted continued to grow. I found myself questioning the path that had been laid out for me. Did I want to be a competition pianist, moving from one high-pressure event to another in pursuit of a perfect score? Or did I want to create music that spoke from and to the heart, regardless of whether it fit the narrow criteria of competition judges? This growing divide between my mother's vision and my own desires created a constant tension in our home. Stephanie, sensing the shift, became my mother's ally, often remarking that I seemed less committed or distracted from my goals. "Maybe Ramona is just not cut out for the pressure," she would suggest with false concern. "Not everyone has the discipline for greatness." Those comments stung, but what hurt more was knowing that neither my mother nor my sister understood what music truly meant to me. To them, it was a path to prestige, a way to stand out. To me, it had become the only authentic form of self-expression I had. As my 18th birthday approached, bringing with it college auditions and the National Young Artist Competition, the pressure reached unprecedented levels. My mother hired a performance coach in addition to my regular teacher. My diet was monitored, my sleep schedule regulated, even my social media accounts were scrutinized to ensure I projected the right image of a serious young artist. What no one saw was how I trembled alone in my room at night. How the joy that had once flowed so naturally through my fingers now had to be excavated from beneath layers of anxiety and expectation. I was becoming a masterful technical pianist while the musician in my soul was slowly suffocating. The National Young Artist Competition was held in Chicago each March, bringing together the top young classical musicians from across the country. For many, it served as a springboard to conservatory scholarships and professional opportunities. For my mother, it represented the culmination of 11 years of carefully orchestrated training and image cultivation. "This is your moment, Ramona," she said, as she packed my performance dress, a conservative black gown she had selected from 5 nearly identical options. "The committee chairman is Dr. Wilson from Curtis. A strong impression here could secure your admission." What she did not know was that the dress would hang untouched in our hotel closet while I sat on the bathroom floor, my chest tight with panic, 40 minutes before my scheduled performance time. The pressure had been building for months. My mother had invited her entire social circle to attend, including several influential family friends who had connections in the classical music world. My father had taken rare time off work to be there. Even Stephanie had flown in from college, though her supportive smile did not reach her eyes. "Just remember, millions of people play the piano," she had said while helping me unpack in the hotel room. "But only you have our mother as your manager. That is your real advantage." The comment was delivered with a squeeze to my shoulder that could have been interpreted as encouragement, but I understood the subtle dig. Any success I achieved was due to our mother's efforts, not my talent. The piece I had prepared was Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. A technically demanding showcase that my mother had selected because it reliably impressed judges. I had mastered every note, but as I practiced in the days leading up to the competition, I felt like a technician rather than an artist. There was no joy in the perfection I had achieved, only the fear of making a mistake. As I sat on that cold bathroom floor, my performance time approaching a clarity came over me. I could not go on stage and play another note without meaning. I could not continue to be a vessel for my mother's ambitions rather than my own musical voice. With shaking hands, I reached into my bag and pulled out the sheet music I had finally written down for the composition I had begun at camp. Over the months, it had evolved into a complex piece that reflected my journey with music. The initial joy, the growing constraints, and the struggle to find authentic expression within those limitations. I had never played it for anyone, but I knew every note by heart. When I walked on stage 10 minutes later, I saw my mother in the third row, her posture perfect, her expectant smile in place. I sat at the piano, closed my eyes, and began to play. Not Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, but my own composition. The first notes were hesitant, like a question being asked in a quiet room. Then the melody began to build, gathering complexity and emotion, telling the story of constraint and yearning for freedom. As I played, everything fell away: the judges, the audience, my mother's ambitions, my own fears. For the first time in years, I was making music because I had something to say, not because I needed to impress. When the final note faded, there was a moment of complete silence before the audience erupted in applause. Through my tears, I could see people standing, their faces showing the same emotion I felt. I had connected with them in a way I never had before. Backstage, my mother's face was a careful mask. In public, she was all proud smiles and gracious nods to the judges and other parents who came to congratulate me. She has always had a creative streak, she said smoothly, when someone asked about the unexpected piece. But the moment we were alone in the hotel room, the mask shattered. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "Do you have any idea what you have done? That was not just any competition. That was your future." "I won," I said quietly. The judges had awarded me first place, moved by what they called the raw authenticity of my performance. "You got lucky," she snapped, "and you embarrassed me in front of everyone. All those people I invited, all those connections I have spent years cultivating. You made me look like I had no control over my own daughter." That was the heart of it, I realized. Not my music, not my future, but her control and her image. "I am not your project, Mom," I said, finding courage in the lingering feeling of freedom from my performance. "I am a musician. Music is not about control. It is about expression." "Naive," she said dismissively. "Expression does not pay conservatory tuition. Sentimentality does not build a career. If you want to play little compositions in your bedroom, fine. But if you want to be a serious pianist, you will play what I tell you to play." The ultimatum hung in the air between us. In her eyes, I saw no room for compromise, no recognition of what I had achieved that day. "Then I do not want to be a serious pianist," I said finally. "Not your kind of serious." The fight that followed involved the entire family. My father tried to mediate, suggesting compromises that satisfied no one. Stephanie sided with our mother, arguing that I was throwing away opportunities other musicians would kill for. Through it all, my mother maintained her position. Play what I tell you to play, or do not play at all. In the end, I chose the latter. When acceptance letters came from conservatories, including Curtis, I declined them all. Instead, I applied to the University of Washington in Seattle, as far from Boston as I could manage, to study music education. The day I left for college, my mother did not come out of her bedroom to say goodbye. The estrangement that followed was both painful and liberating. My father called occasionally, his voice apologetic but unwilling to directly contradict my mother's position. Stephanie sent formal birthday cards with no personal message. My mother's silence was complete. In Seattle, I would sometimes sit at the practice pianos in empty classrooms, my fingers hovering over the keys, unable to play. The music that had been my voice for so long was now tangled with trauma and loss. It would take years before I could separate the two, before playing would bring joy rather than trigger memories of that final confrontation. But in walking away, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming music for myself, even if it meant not playing at all for a while. Seattle embraced me, with its rain-washed streets and coffee-scented air. 3,000 miles from Boston, I could breathe without feeling the weight of expectations pressing on my chest. The University of Washington campus became my sanctuary, its red brick buildings and towering trees sheltering me as I cautiously built a new identity separate from being Amanda's talented daughter. My focus on music education rather than performance raised eyebrows among my professors, who had reviewed my audition tapes and recognized my technical abilities. "You could easily be in the performance track," Professor Larson told me after my first semester. "Your technique is exceptional." "I want to teach," I replied simply. What I could not explain was how performance had become contaminated for me, how the stage now represented not freedom but constraint. Gradually, I found a new relationship with music through teaching. My first students were neighborhood children whose parents wanted affordable lessons. I started with beginners 6 and 7-year-olds, just discovering the piano. Watching their small fingers press keys with no thought of perfection, only curiosity and delight, reminded me of what I had loved about playing before competitions, and criticism entered the picture. By my second year, I had developed a specialty in working with children with learning disabilities. There was a boy named Anthony with severe dyslexia who struggled with reading music but had an incredible ear. A girl named Zoe with ADHD who needed movement breaks every 10 minutes but composed beautiful, chaotic melodies that reflected her racing mind. These students approached music on their own terms, and in helping them find their way, I began to find my way back as well. Seattle also brought me Michael, a graduate student in environmental science who lived in my apartment building. We met in the laundry room during my third year, both of us folding clothes while the rain pounded against the windows. He asked me to dinner, and for the first time I found myself telling someone the whole story of my past, the competitions, my mother's control, the final breaking point. "So you do not play anymore?" "At all," he asked, genuine confusion on his face. "I play to teach," I said. "Demonstrations, accompaniment, just not for myself." "That seems like punishing yourself for someone else's failures," he observed quietly. The relationship lasted just over a year, ending when Michael received a research position in Australia. But his perspective stayed with me, making me question whether my refusal to perform was a form of self-protection or self-sabotage. One Christmas Eve alone in my apartment, while a snowstorm raged outside, I sat at the small keyboard I used for lesson planning and placed my fingers on the keys. For the first time in years, I played for no one but myself. Just simple Christmas carols at first, then pieces from my childhood, and finally, hesitantly, the composition that had won the competition and cost me my family. I cried through most of it, but when I finished, something had shifted. The music was mine again, at least in private. My contact with my family remained minimal during these years. My father called on birthdays and holidays, our conversations polite but superficial. He never mentioned my mother unless I asked directly, and then only to say that she was doing well or busy with her charity work. Stephanie's communications were even more sparse, occasional text messages or formal announcements of her achievements. I built a small but meaningful life in Seattle. My piano students grew in number and ability. I completed my degree and began working at a music therapy center, combining my teaching skills with therapeutic approaches for children with special needs. I had friends, a cozy apartment, a routine that brought satisfaction, if not excitement. Then, 7 years after leaving Boston, an envelope arrived with a Boston postmark. Inside was an invitation to Stephanie's wedding to Derek Sullivan, a neurological surgeon she had met during her hospital fundraising work. The invitation was addressed in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, though the note inside was signed by Stephanie. "It would mean a lot to have you there," she had written, though the formal tone conveyed obligation more than desire. My initial instinct was to decline. The thought of facing my mother, of enduring her cool assessment of my life choices, made my stomach clench. But that evening, my phone rang with my father's number. "She is getting married," he said, without preamble when I answered. "Your sister." "I got the invitation today," I replied. "Will you come?" His voice sounded older, more tired than I remembered. "It would mean a lot, to all of us." The all of us gave me pause. I doubted my mother had expressed any particular desire to have me attend, but the plea in my father's voice was real. "I will think about it," I promised. After 2 weeks of deliberation, I replied with my acceptance. Perhaps enough time had passed. Perhaps it was time to see if healing was possible, or at least a cordial coexistence. As I packed for the trip back east, I hesitated before my closet. On the highest shelf was a folder I had not opened since leaving Boston, my sheet music, including the handwritten composition from the competition. After a moment's consideration, I added it to my suitcase. Just in case, I told myself, though, I could not articulate what situation might arise where I would need it. Boston's familiar skyline greeted me through the airplane window, the sight sending a mix of nostalgia and anxiety through my chest. The taxi ride to my parents' home in the suburbs felt like traveling backward in time. As we pulled into the driveway of the white colonial house with its perfectly manicured lawn, I saw that nothing had visibly changed. It was as though the house had been preserved in amber, waiting for my return. My father opened the door before I could ring the bell, his smile warm but his eyes cautious. "Ramona," he said, pulling me into a hug that felt both familiar and foreign. "You look well." "So do you, Dad," I lied. In truth, he had aged more than 7 years should account for. His hair was now completely gray and lines etched his face that had not been there when I left. My mother appeared behind him, her posture as perfect as ever, her honey blonde hair now expertly colored to hide any gray. Her pearl necklace still adorned her neck, and her smile was the practiced one she used for company rather than family. "Ramona," she said with a nod, not moving to embrace me. "I am glad you could make it. Stephanie will be pleased." The formality in her tone made it clear that whatever reconciliation my father might have hoped for would not come easily, if at all. Stephanie and her fiancé, Derek, arrived for dinner that evening. My sister had matured into a polished version of our mother, from her carefully highlighted hair to her tasteful diamond engagement ring. Derek was exactly the type of man I would have expected her to choose. Handsome in a conventional way, confident, clearly successful, and utterly devoted to Stephanie. "Ramona, we are so glad you could come," Stephanie said, air kissing near my cheek. "Derek, this is my sister, the one I told you about. She lives in Seattle now." "The musician, right?" Derek said, shaking my hand. "Stephanie mentioned you were quite the prodigy." "I teach now," I corrected gently. "Music education for special needs children." "How?" Rewarding, my mother commented in a tone that suggested anything but. Dinner was a masterclass in surface-level conversation. We discussed the wedding arrangements, Derek's work at the hospital, the unseasonably warm weather. No one mentioned the years of estrangement or the reason for it. It was as if we had all agreed to pretend I had simply been away on an extended trip rather than having cut ties with the family. As dessert was being served, my mother casually cleared her throat. "Ramona, I was hoping you might help us with a small matter for the wedding," she said, her tone deliberately light. "The cocktail hour after the ceremony needs some musical accompaniment, and the quartet we booked is only available for the reception itself. Since you will be there anyway, we thought perhaps you could play for an hour or so. Nothing fancy, just some background music while people mingle." The request hung in the air. 7 years of silence, and this was what she wanted from me, to provide the soundtrack to my sister's perfect day. Not as a valued family member, but as convenient entertainment. "I do not really perform anymore," I said carefully. "It has been years." "Oh, it is not really performing," my mother dismissed with a wave of her hand. "Just some light classical pieces in the background. No one will be paying much attention." It is that or recorded music, and that seems so impersonal for Stephanie's special day. I looked at my sister, wondering if this had been her idea or our mother's. Her expression gave nothing away. "We would appreciate it," Stephanie added. "The venue has a beautiful grand piano that just sits there unused." My father looked uncomfortable but said nothing, his eyes fixed on his plate. Derek seemed oblivious to the underlying tension, happily finishing his crème brûlée. "I will think about it," I finally said, knowing even as the words left my mouth that I would agree. Refusing would only create a scene, and I had not come all this way to reopen old wounds. The next day, I accompanied my mother and Stephanie to the venue for a final walkthrough. The Westfield Country Club was exactly the kind of place my mother had always envisioned for Stephanie's wedding, elegant, traditional, with sweeping views of manicured gardens. As we toured the space, I noticed the grand piano positioned in the corner of the cocktail lounge area, partially hidden behind a large floral arrangement. "There it is," my mother said, following my gaze. "Nothing special required, just some pleasant music to fill the space. The real musicians are quite expensive, you know, only available for the main reception. This way we will have something nice for the cocktail hour without the additional expense." The dismissal in her tone was unmistakable. I was not a real musician in her eyes anymore. I was a cost-effective solution to a minor logistical problem. As Stephanie discussed centerpiece arrangements with the wedding planner, I overheard my mother's voice from behind a partition. "My other daughter will provide some ambient noise during the cocktail hour," she was saying to someone. "Just piano. Nothing that will distract from the socializing." Ambient noise, background music. The words stung more than they should have after all this time. Despite my professional accomplishments, my mother still saw my music as insignificant, worthy only of being ignored at a social function. For a moment, I considered backing out, making an excuse, even leaving early. But a familiar stubborn streak kept me from giving her the satisfaction. I would play. I would be the dutiful daughter and sister for this one weekend. And then I would return to Seattle, and the life I had built for myself free from these subtle degradations. The night before the wedding, after the rehearsal dinner where I sat at a table with distant cousins rather than with the immediate family, I returned to the venue alone. I had asked the coordinator for access to the piano, claiming I needed to check its tuning and action before the event. In the empty cocktail lounge with only security lights illuminating the space, I sat at the piano and ran my fingers over the keys. It was a Steinway well-maintained and responsive. I played softly at first scales and simple exercises to reacquaint myself with the instrument. Then, almost without conscious thought, I began to play more complex pieces, Debussy's Clair de Lune, Chopin's Nocturne, in E-flat major pieces I had not performed in years, but that lived in my muscle memory. The sound filled the empty room, echoing off the high ceilings and polished floors. In the solitude with no judgmental ears to critique or dismiss, I remembered what it felt like to play for the pure joy of making music. For a brief moment, I was that 7-year-old girl again, discovering the piano for the first time before competitions and expectations had complicated everything. As I left the venue, I felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened tomorrow, I would play on my own terms. The realization did not solve the complicated dynamics with my family, but it gave me a small island of control in the sea of their expectations. The day of Stephanie's wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect early summer day that wedding planners dream about. I got ready in my childhood bedroom, now converted to a generic guest room with no trace of the teenage girl who had once lived there. The pale blue dress I had brought for the occasion was appropriate but not flashy, designed to blend in rather than stand out. Which I reminded myself was exactly what my mother wanted from me today, to be present but not noticeable, to provide a service without drawing attention. The ceremony was held in the country club's garden white chairs, arranged in neat rows, facing an arch covered in pale pink roses and greenery. I was seated in the 5th row, not with the immediate family at the front, but not relegation to the back either. A diplomatic middle ground that felt symbolic of my current status, acknowledged, but kept at a distance. Stephanie was radiant as our father walked her down the aisle. Her dress was classic and elegant, exactly what our mother would have chosen, perhaps had chosen. Derek waited at the altar, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration as he watched his bride approach. Their vows were traditional, their kiss appropriately passionate but restrained. The perfect society wedding carefully orchestrated down to the last detail. Throughout the ceremony, I caught glimpses of my mother in the front row, her posture impeccable, dabbing occasionally at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. This was her crowning achievement as a mother, her elder daughter marrying well, the perfect culmination of years of social grooming and expectation management. I wondered briefly if she ever thought about what might have been her other crowning achievement, a daughter at Carnegie Hall, had things gone differently. After the ceremony, guests moved to the cocktail lounge while the wedding party took photos. I slipped away from the crowd to the corner where the grand piano waited. As I arranged my sheet music, the wedding coordinator approached with a strained smile. "We would like you to start playing as guests. Enter something light and unobtrusive," she instructed. "Your mother suggested Debussy, or perhaps some simple Mozart. Nothing too demanding of attention." I nodded, swallowing the reflexive response that rose in my throat. Taking a deep breath, I began to play as the first guests entered the room. Gentle, flowing pieces that would not interfere with conversation. My fingers moved automatically, while my mind drifted, thinking about the students waiting for me back in Seattle, the life I had built that had nothing to do with impressing people like those filling this room. For the first 20 minutes, no one approached the piano. Guests gathered in clusters around high-top tables, champagne glasses in hand, attention focused on each other rather than the music. Exactly as my mother had planned, I was providing ambient sound, nothing more. A human equivalent to recorded music, but with the added prestige of being the bride's sister. Then through the crowd, I spotted a familiar face that sent a jolt through my fingers, causing a minor discord in the Mozart piece I was playing. Mr. Sokolov, my first piano teacher, was standing near the bar, his posture still erect despite his now entirely white hair. He must be well into his 70s by now, I realized. Our eyes met across the room, and he tilted his head, listening more intently to my playing than anyone else in the room. After a moment, he made his way toward me, navigating between chattering guests with purpose. When he reached the piano, he stood silently observing my technique with the same critical eye I remembered from childhood lessons. "Ramona," he said finally, his Russian accent still thick after all these years in America. "You play like someone who is afraid of her own voice." The observation struck me like a physical blow. In that moment, I saw myself clearly hunched slightly over the keys, deliberately making myself smaller, playing notes perfectly but without soul, providing the musical wallpaper my mother had requested. Mr. Sokolov leaned closer. "I remember a girl who played like she had something important to say. Is she still in there somewhere?" Before I could respond, he straightened and gave me a small nod. "Play something real, Ramona. Not for them. For you." He moved away back into the crowd, leaving me with his words ringing in my ears alongside the polite, forgettable music coming from my fingers. For several minutes, I continued as before, my thoughts racing. Around me, the cocktail hour was in full swing. I could see my mother across the room elegantly working the crowd, occasionally glancing in my direction with a satisfied nod when she caught my eye. Stephanie and Derek had arrived, and were being congratulated by a swarm of well-wishers. No one was listening to the piano. I was as intended background noise. But Mr. Sokolov was listening, and suddenly I realized, so was I. My hands faltered for a moment, then stilled completely. In the small pause, a few nearby guests glanced curiously in my direction, but most continued their conversations uninterrupted. I took a deep breath and placed my fingers back on the keys. This time I began to play my own composition, the piece that had won the competition and severed my relationship with my mother. It started softly, almost matching the volume of the previous pieces, but with an intensity that was immediately different. The melody posed a question, tentative at first, then growing in confidence and complexity. As the music shifted from background to foreground, I noticed a subtle change in the room. A few people near the piano paused in their conversations, turning slightly toward the sound. The piece built gradually, layering emotions that reflected my journey. The early joy of discovery, the constraints of expectation, the pain of rejection, and finally, the struggle toward authenticity. By the time I reached the middle section, a hush had fallen over the nearest third of the room. I was no longer looking at the guests, my focus entirely on the music flowing through my fingers. This was not about them anymore. This was about reclaiming something that had been taken from me or that I had given away too easily. The composition crescendoed, filling the room with sound that could no longer be ignored. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother making her way toward the piano, a tight smile fixed on her face. But before she could reach me, an older gentleman I did not recognize stepped into her path, engaged her in conversation, effectively blocking her approach. Whether deliberate or coincidental, the intervention allowed me to continue uninterrupted. More guests had gathered around the piano now, drinks forgotten in hands, conversation ceased. I played with every ounce of emotion I had suppressed over the years, the resentment, the loss, the rediscovery of joy, through teaching all of it, pouring through my fingers into the keys. The music spoke what I had never been able to say aloud to my family, that I had value beyond their expectations, that my voice mattered even when they tried to silence it. As I approached the final movement, I was aware of complete silence in the room. Even the servers had paused, trays of canapes suspended mid-route. I could feel the weight of attention, not as pressure, but as connection. For the first time in years, I was truly performing, truly communicating through music. The final notes were questioning, open-ended rather than conclusive, suggesting a story still being written. As the sound faded, the silence held for a heartbeat, 2-3. Then applause erupted, startling in its volume and enthusiasm. I looked up to find myself surrounded by guests, their faces showing genuine emotion. An older woman wiped tears from her eyes. A young man in a perfectly tailored suit was shaking his head in amazement. "That was extraordinary," someone said. "Are you a professional?" Before I could answer, Mr. Sokolov appeared at my side, his weathered hand squeezing my shoulder in silent approval. His eyes were bright, with unshed tears. That, he said softly, was the Ramona I remembered. Across the room, my mother stood frozen, her practiced smile entirely gone, replaced by an expression I could not quite read. Stephanie was beside her, whispering something in her ear, her own face showing surprise and what might have been genuine admiration. Several guests approached to ask about the piece, whether I performed regularly if I taught master classes. I answered their questions in a daze still vibrating with the emotional release of the performance. A few people pressed business cards into my hand, mentioning music schools or performance opportunities. When the coordinator appeared to announce that the reception was beginning in the main ballroom, guests moved reluctantly away from the piano, many stopping to thank me or comment on the unexpected musical interlude. Mr. Sokolov remained studying me with the same intensity he had shown in our lessons years ago. "You have been hiding," he said finally. "Not just from them, but from yourself." "I teach now," I said, the explanation sounding hollow even to my own ears. "Teaching is noble," he acknowledged, "but not at the expense of your own voice. I have a colleague starting a recording project, new compositions by emerging artists. You should send him this piece." He pressed his own card into my hand on which he had written another name and email address. "No pressure, no competitions, just music that deserves to be heard," he added. "Think about it." As guests filed out toward the reception, I remained at the piano, my fingers still resting lightly on the keys. My mother approached, finally her composure recovered, but her eyes guarded. "That was not what we discussed," she said, her voice controlled. "No," I agreed. "It was not. People are talking about it rather than about Stephanie and Derek." "They will talk about both," I replied. "The beautiful wedding and the unexpected music. Is that so terrible?" She did not answer directly, her gaze shifting to the now empty room. "You always had to make everything about yourself," she said finally, but the accusation lacked its usual bite. "I have to go join the head table," she added after a moment. "Will you be coming to the reception?" "In a minute," I said, needing time to process what had just happened. She nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "It was good," she said without turning back. "You're playing. Different, but good." The words were not an apology or even a full acknowledgement, but coming from my mother, they were significant. Before I could respond, she was gone, heels clicking purposefully across the polished floor toward her perfect daughter's perfect reception. I slipped out of the reception early, after the required family photos and toasts. No one seemed to notice my departure except my father, who caught my eye across the room and gave me a small, understanding nod. The Uber ride back to my hotel was silent, my mind replaying the unexpected events of the cocktail hour. My phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications, and when I finally checked it in my hotel room, I found that several guests had already posted about my performance on social media, tagging me in videos I did not realize had been recorded. "Who is this pianist?" one caption read. Her original composition brought the entire cocktail hour to a standstill. I sat on the edge of the bed watching a shaky video of myself playing, seeing the intensity in my posture that I had not been conscious of in the moment. The comments beneath the post were filled with praise from wedding guests and their connections. Somehow, in trying to relegate me to background music, my mother had inadvertently given me a platform and an audience more receptive than any competition panel. The week after the wedding, I extended my stay in Boston at Mr. Sokolov's invitation. He had arranged for me to use a practice room at the community music school, where he still taught occasional master classes. There, surrounded by the familiar sounds of students practicing scales and fumbling through simple pieces, I began to reconnect with the core of my musical identity. "You must decide what music means to you now," Mr. Sokolov told me over tea in his small office. "Not what it meant to your mother, not what it meant to you as a child, but what it means to Ramona today." The question stayed with me as I returned to Seattle to my students and my ordered life. But something had shifted. I found myself staying after hours in the music therapy center, using the piano there to work on new compositions. The piece I had played at the wedding had broken open a creative dam, and now music poured out that reflected my adult experiences, the pain of family estrangement, the joy of helping my students find their voices, the quiet satisfaction of building a life on my own terms. 3 weeks after the wedding, my phone rang with my mother's number, something that had not happened in 7 years. I answered with trepidation. "Ramona," she said, her voice formal as ever. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "No," I replied. "I just finished with my last student for the day." An awkward pause followed. "I received several calls after the wedding," she continued. People asking about you, about your music. The Henderson's daughter is apparently considering music therapy as a career path now after hearing about your work. I waited, unsure where this was headed. Your playing was not what I expected, she said finally. It has been a long time since I heard you play anything of substance. Coming from my mother, this was as close to a compliment as I was likely to get. Thank you, I said simply. I may not have always understood your choices, she continued, the admission, clearly difficult for her. But it seems you have found your own path. It was not an apology for years of pressure and manipulation. It was not an acknowledgement of the harm her expectations had caused, but it was something, a small crack in the wall between us. I confirmed. It is different from what you imagined for me, but it is mine. Yes, well, she said, her tone brisk again. Stephanie asked me to call. She and Derek would like to have you over for dinner when they return from their honeymoon. Apparently, Derek's younger brother is considering piano lessons for his daughter. The transparent attempt to return our interaction to a transactional basis to put me in the role of service provider rather than family member might have stung once. Now I recognized it as my mother's way of maintaining some control over a relationship that was changing without her permission. I will be back in Seattle by then, I reminded her, but I can recommend some excellent teachers in the Boston area. Of course, she said. I will let her know. After we hung up, I sat at my small kitchen table processing the conversation. It was not reconciliation, not really, but it was communication. After years of silence, even this stilted exchange represented progress. 2 days later, I received a text message from Stephanie, the first direct communication from her that was not a formal announcement or obligatory holiday greeting. Your playing was amazing, she wrote. I have never heard that piece before. Did you write it? When I confirmed that I had, her response surprised me. I never realized. I always thought you just played what Mom picked out. You are really talented, Ramona. On your own, I mean. It was the first time my sister had acknowledged me as separate from our mother's influence, as having value independent of the path that had been chosen for me. Our subsequent messages were cautious, but increasingly genuine, building a tentative bridge between the adults we had become rather than the roles we had been assigned as children. My father called more frequently now, our conversations gradually becoming less superficial. He never directly addressed the years of standing by, while my mother controlled my musical development, but in his gentle inquiries about my current work and compositions, I sensed a desire to know the daughter he had failed to protect. In Seattle, I began to integrate performance back into my life in small, deliberate ways. I organized a recital for my students where I performed alongside them, showing them that their teacher practiced what she taught about musical courage. I accepted an invitation to play at a fundraiser for the Music Therapy Center. Each small step back toward public performance helped heal the association between playing and anxiety that had been ingrained in me since adolescence. 6 months after the wedding, I received an email from the connection Mr. Sokolov had provided. The recording project was moving forward, and they were still interested in including my composition if I was willing to record it professionally. The opportunity came with no strings attached, no competitions to win, no judges to impress, simply a chance to share my musical voice with a wider audience. In a studio in downtown Seattle, with rain pattering against the windows and a technician I had just met as my only audience, I recorded the piece that had changed the course of my relationship with music and my family. As I played, I realized how much the composition had evolved since I first created it as a teenager. The melody still spoke of constraint and yearning for freedom, but now it also contained resolution, acceptance, even moments of unexpected joy. When the recording was complete, the technician removed his headphones and gave me a thoughtful look. That was something special, he said. What do you call it? I had never given the piece a formal title, thinking of it only as my composition or sometimes the competition piece. But now, with the recording finished and this chapter of my healing coming to a close, I knew what it should be called. Background music, I told him with a small smile. It is called background music. 1 year after Stephanie's wedding, I gave my first public concert in a decade. It was a small venue, an intimate performance space attached to a local arts center. My students came along with colleagues from the Music Therapy Center and friends I had made in Seattle. To my surprise, my father flew in from Boston to attend. He sat in the front row, his eyes moist, as I performed a program that included both classical pieces and my own compositions. Afterward, as we shared a late dinner, he said something I had waited decades to hear. "I am proud of you, Ramona. Not because you performed brilliantly tonight, though you did. I am proud of you for finding your way back to what you love on your own terms." My mother did not attend the concert, but she sent a text message that evening. "Your father says it went well. The Andersons' niece is at Berkeley College now and mentioned your recording." It was not wholehearted approval or understanding, but it was acknowledgement, and for now that was enough. My journey with music continues to evolve. I still teach, finding profound satisfaction in helping others discover their musical voices. I perform occasionally when the venue and opportunity feel right. I compose regularly, no longer hiding my creations, but sharing them with an audience that has grown steadily through word of mouth and social media. The wound of my early experiences has not disappeared entirely. There are still moments when I sit at the piano and feel the ghost of my mother's expectations hovering over my shoulder. But those moments grow rarer as I continue to reclaim music as my own. What my mother never understood was that music is not about control or perfection or impressing an audience. It is about authentic expression, about saying something true. When she tried to relegate me to providing background music at my sister's wedding, she inadvertently gave me the opportunity to rediscover my authentic voice. In trying to make me invisible, she made me seen in a way I had not been in years. To anyone watching this who has been told to make themselves smaller to blend into the background to serve as ambient noise in someone else's story, I want you to know your voice matters. Your talent is worth being heard. Your authentic expression is more powerful than any role others try to assign you. Has someone ever tried to minimize your gifts or talents? How did you reclaim them? Share your story in the comments below. And if my journey resonated with you, please hit subscribe to join me for more conversations about finding your voice after silence. Thank you for listening, and remember that sometimes the most powerful music begins as a whisper that someone tried to silence.